There's a crack in the rock face, nothing more than a slender canyon barely wide enough for two people to pass. You wouldn't notice it if you didn't know where to look. But walk through that crack, through a mile of towering stone that blocks out the sun, and you'll emerge into a moment that stops your heart. A massive temple facade, 6 stories tall, carved directly into rose-red sandstone. It's called the Treasury, except it was never a treasury, and we still don't actually know what it was. This is Petra, Jordan's Rose City, a place where nearly everything we think we know turns out to be wrong, where the Nabataean people, a culture most of the world had forgotten, built a civilization so sophisticated it makes modern engineers pause and reconsider. I've walked through that narrow canyon 4 times now, 4 times, and the Treasury still takes my breath away. But that initial wonder is just the beginning, because Petra holds secrets that go deeper than its famous facade, mysteries that whisper questions we haven't yet learned how to answer. Stand with me now in the desert of southern Jordan. We're going to explore 4 mysteries that continue to puzzle researchers, challenge our assumptions about ancient capabilities, and remind us how much we've yet to understand. The Sick, the narrow gorge that leads to Petra, feels like walking through a geological cathedral. The walls rise 80 meters on either side, closing in until you can touch both sides with outstretched arms. The rock face shifts through shades of red, orange, cream, and purple as you go deeper. Then, through a final turn, the canyon opens like a curtain drawing back. And there it is, Al-Khazne, the Treasury. Even though I knew it was coming, even though I'd seen 1,000 photographs, the physical reality of it struck me silent. The facade stands 40 meters high, carved with architectural precision that would challenge modern stonemasons. 6 massive columns support an elaborate upper level decorated with figures and urns. Every surface is deliberate, every proportion is exact, and every single centimeter was carved from the living rock of the mountain itself. The structure you're looking at today was completed roughly 2,000 years ago, likely during the 1st century CE. We know this from architectural analysis and ceramic evidence found at the site. But here's what troubles researchers. We have no contemporary accounts of its construction. No Nabataean texts explaining the techniques, no diagrams, no tools left behind. The people who made this took their methods with them into silence. Picture this landscape 2 millennia ago. Petra sits in the Shara Mountains, surrounded by desert, but the climate then was slightly different from today, marginally wetter, supporting more vegetation. This was the beating heart of a trade empire. Caravans carrying frankincense from Yemen, silk from China, spices from India, all passed through Nabataean hands. Petra was where desert routes converged, where traders rested, where wealth accumulated. The Nabataeans controlled something more valuable than gold in a desert. They controlled water, and they used their wealth to transform bare rock into impossible architecture. But the Treasury isn't just impressive, it's unexplainable in specific technical ways that matter. The carving was done from top to bottom. This is documented, confirmed by analysis of the chisel marks and the progression of the work. The sculptors started at the peak of the facade, 40 meters above ground, and worked their way down. No scaffolding marks exist on the rock face, no evidence of the massive wooden structures that would have been necessary using conventional methods. Some researchers suggest they carved downward from the cliff top above, but the angles don't quite work. The overhang would have made that approach extraordinarily difficult for the detailed lower sections. Here's the part that kept me standing in front of it, staring upward until my neck ached. The precision is consistent from top to bottom. The proportions are mathematically exact. The columns are perfectly vertical. This isn't rough stone carving. This is architectural sophistication that requires measurement, planning, and tools capable of detailed work on one of the hardest sandstones in the region.
The urn at the very top, more than 40 meters above the ground, shows the same quality of craftsmanship as the columns at ground level.
Modern laser scanning of the treasury has revealed something else peculiar. The facade aligns with specific astronomical events. During the winter solstice, sunlight strikes the facade in a very particular way, illuminating certain features while leaving others in shadow. This appears to be intentional, which means the Nabataeans weren't just carving a monument, they were integrating it into a larger understanding of celestial mechanics and seasonal cycles. They positioned and designed this structure with astronomical knowledge we're only beginning to appreciate. Scientific investigation has added measurements, but multiplied questions. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there are chambers beneath the treasury, still unexcavated. The visible interior chamber, a square room carved into the rock behind the facade, seems almost disappointingly simple compared to the ornate exterior. It contains nothing now but bare stone and 3 burial chambers cut into the walls. Was this the original purpose? A royal tomb? The positioning seems too theatrical, too public for a tomb. Nabataean tombs elsewhere in Petra are impressive, but more discreet. Alternative theories circulate among researchers. Some suggest it was a temple, possibly dedicated to the Nabataean goddess Aluza. The astronomical alignments support this interpretation. Others point out that the interior space seems designed for assembly, perhaps for ritual viewing of the illuminated facade during specific celestial events. A third group argues we're wrong to separate function into modern categories, that for the Nabataeans, tomb, temple, and astronomical observatory might have been integrated concepts we no longer understand. What strikes me most about this place is the absolute confidence required to attempt it. Imagine being the architect who proposed carving 40 meters into solid rock with nothing but copper tools and determination. Imagine convincing a king to fund it. Imagine the generations of workers who spent decades creating something they might never see completed. That kind of civilization-level commitment suggests the treasury was more than decoration. It was central to Nabataean identity in ways we've lost. The modern experience of approaching the treasury hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. You still walk through the same narrow gorge, though it's wider now from erosion and carved deeper from flash floods that still occasionally roar through. You still emerge from darkness into that sudden vision of rose-colored stone. Tour groups crowd the plaza in front of it, thousands every day. But if you come at dawn, before the crowds, the silence feels ancient. The rock still changes color as the sun climbs, shifting through shades the photographs never quite capture. After everything I've learned, after reading the archaeological reports, examining the laser scans, discussing theories with researchers, I find myself more puzzled than when I started. The treasury is more sophisticated than it first appears. Every answer reveals 3 new questions. The Nabataeans accomplished something here that we can measure but cannot fully explain. And that gap between measurement and understanding is where the real mystery lives. We call it the treasury because of a legend. Local Bedouin believe the urn at the top contained the treasure of a pharaoh. They shot at it for generations, trying to break it open. The bullet marks are still visible, but the urn is solid rock, carved from the same stone as everything else. There was never any treasure inside. The real treasure is the structure itself and the unanswered questions it preserves. Petra sits in one of the most inhospitable environments imaginable for a major city. Annual rainfall, less than 15 centimeters. Summer temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. The nearest permanent water source, more than a day's journey away. And yet, at its peak around the 1st century CE, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people lived here. Not just survived, thrived, maintained gardens, operated fountains, supported a population density that should have been impossible. The secret is written in stone, carved into cliffsides, buried beneath centuries of sand. The Nabataeans were water magicians, and their hydraulic engineering was so sophisticated that modern hydrologists study it with something approaching disbelief. Start with the Sick, the narrow canyon every visitor walks through.
Look up as you enter, and you'll see something easy to miss if you don't know to look for it. A channel carved into the rock face, running along the canyon wall about 4 meters above the floor. This channel brought water from springs in the hills outside Petra, channeling it through the Sick and into the city center. The gradient is precise, just enough slope to maintain flow without creating erosion or allowing sediment to settle and clog the channel. But here's what makes it remarkable. The Nabataeans carved this channel knowing that the Sick floods. Flash floods still roar through this canyon during heavy rains, walls of water that can reach 6 meters high. So they built the channel above the flood line and carved overflow channels to divert excess water safely away. They engineered this system 2,000 years ago without computer modeling, without modern surveying equipment. They got the calculations right. The environment around Petra in ancient times was slightly different from today, but not dramatically so. This was always desert, always harsh. The wadis, the dry riverbeds, only flowed during seasonal rains. Springs existed in the surrounding hills, but the water they provided was limited. To support a population of thousands required capturing every possible drop and wasting none of it. Walk through Petra today and the evidence is everywhere once you learn to see it. Channels carved into rock faces, ceramic pipes, yes, ceramic pipes with joints sealed with hydraulic cement running through walls and beneath streets. Cisterns carved into stone, some small enough for a household, others massive enough to hold hundreds of cubic meters. Dams built across wadis to capture seasonal floods and direct them into storage. The mystery isn't just that they built these systems, it's how sophisticated the systems were, how carefully engineered, how they demonstrate principles of hydraulic engineering that supposedly weren't formalized for centuries.
Take the ceramic pipe system. Researchers have documented sections of this piping throughout Petra, particularly around the city center. The pipes are tapered, narrower at one end than the other, so they fit together in a way that creates pressure and maintains flow. The Nabataeans understood hydraulic pressure. They built pressure-fed systems that could move water uphill using nothing but gravity-powered siphon principles. We have the physical evidence in museums in Jordan. We can see exactly how they did it. What we can't fully explain is how they figured it out. Modern hydraulic engineers who've studied the Petra system note several features that shouldn't exist in 1st century BCE technology. The understanding of water pressure and flow rates evident in the pipe dimensions. The use of settling tanks to remove sediment before water entered the distribution system. The redundancy built into the network, multiple pathways for water to reach critical locations, ensuring the system remained functional even if one channel failed or became blocked. There's a dam on the hills above Petra, the Wadi Mudlim Dam, that particularly troubles engineers who examine it. Built of cut stone blocks fitted together without mortar, it stands roughly 12 meters high and 40 meters long. The engineering is precise enough that it still functions today, after 2,000 years of seasonal floods. The placement captures water from a wadi that drains a large area of the surrounding hills. The outlet channel directs water into the main distribution system at exactly the right gradient to maintain flow throughout the city. Multiple theories exist about how the Nabataeans developed this expertise. Some researchers point to earlier civilizations, the Romans, the Greeks, and suggest borrowed knowledge, but the timing doesn't quite work. Petra's most sophisticated water systems predate significant Roman presence in the region, and the techniques used are distinctly Nabataean, adapted specifically to this environment and local conditions. Others suggest trial and error over generations. The Nabataeans controlled this territory for centuries, plenty of time to experiment and refine. But that explanation feels insufficient for the level of sophistication achieved. This isn't crude trial and error. This is mathematical precision and engineering principles applied consistently across hundreds of different installations. What researchers find particularly fascinating is the evidence of ongoing innovation. Later additions to the water system show refinements and improvements to earlier techniques.
The Nabataeans were actively developing their understanding, not just maintaining inherited knowledge. They were engineers and experimenters, testing ideas and implementing successful innovations throughout their city. The connection between this hydraulic mastery and Nabataean culture runs deep. Local traditions in the region still speak of ancient people who could make water flow upward and bring springs from stone. Some of these stories clearly reference the visible ruins. Others describe installations that haven't yet been found or have been destroyed. Oral traditions among Bedouin families who have lived in and around Petra for generations include detailed knowledge of where ancient cisterns and channels are located, sometimes leading archaeologists to discoveries they would have otherwise missed. Visit Petra today, and most tourists never notice the water systems. They're focused on the spectacular tomb facades and temples carved into the cliff faces. But look down instead of up. Notice the channels cut into the pavement, the cistern openings, the barely visible remains of ceramic pipes emerging from eroded walls. The whole city was a hydraulic machine designed to capture, store, and distribute the one resource that made everything else possible. Stand in the city center during one of Petra's rare rainstorms, and you can still see traces of the original system functioning. Water flows along ancient channels, diverts through intended passages, collects in cisterns exactly as designed 2 millennia ago. It's eerie and beautiful, watching ancient engineering still performing its intended function after everything else has fallen to ruin. My own feeling is that we consistently underestimate the Nabataeans because they left few written records. We know them through their enemies and trading partners, Greek and Roman sources that described them but didn't explain them. The water system is physical proof of intellectual and technical achievement that matches or exceeds contemporary civilizations we consider more advanced. They solved problems in this specific environment that no one else had solved, and they did it so well that their solutions still work. The real question isn't just how they built it, it's why this knowledge was lost. How does a civilization develop hydraulic engineering this sophisticated and then have that expertise disappear without being transmitted forward? When Petra declined in importance after the trade routes shifted, the knowledge seems to have vanished with it. Later civilizations in the same region never achieved anything comparable. We're left with ruins that demonstrate capabilities we can observe but cannot fully account for. There's a structure in central Petra that archaeologists called the Great Temple for decades. It seemed obvious. Massive terraced complex, grand staircases, elaborate columns, positioned prominently in the city center. Had to be a temple. Everyone agreed on this. Papers were published, tours were given. The Great Temple of Petra became accepted fact. Then they excavated the interior and found a theater. The discovery story is recent enough that some of the researchers involved are still actively working. Brown University began systematic excavation of the Great Temple complex in 1993 under the direction of Dr. Martha Sharp Jakowski. The site had been known for over a century. It's impossible to miss, covering roughly 7,000 square meters of the city center. But serious archaeological investigation had been limited. Earlier explorers documented what was visible, noted the obvious temple-like qualities, and moved on to more dramatic tomb facades. The Brown team began with the assumption they were excavating a temple. The first seasons confirmed that assumption. They uncovered the lower temenos, a massive colonnaded courtway, a monumental staircase, the east and west corridors lined with columns. Everything pointed to exactly what everyone expected, a major religious complex following patterns familiar from other Greco-Roman influenced sites. Then, in the 2000 season, excavating the main building's interior, they found rows of seating carved into the rock, seating that faced a central area, a theatrical configuration, in the middle of what was supposed to be a temple. Picture Petra in its prime, around 50 CE. The city has grown wealthy beyond imagination, trade routes bringing goods from Arabia, Africa, India, and China all converge here. The Nabataeans have managed to maintain semi-independence even as Roman power expands around them. The city center is a showcase of architectural ambition. Temples, administrative buildings, marketplaces, all built in a style that blends Nabataean traditions with Hellenistic influences absorbed from centuries of trade contact. The Great Temple, or whatever we should call it now, dominates this landscape. The approach is deliberately dramatic. You climb a broad staircase to the lower temenos, walk through the colonnaded courtyard, climb another monumental staircase to the upper temenos, pass between more columns, and finally enter the main building. Every step of this approach is designed to impress, to create anticipation, to remind you of the power and sophistication of the civilization that built it. But once inside, you find yourself in a space that doesn't quite match any known category. The theatrical seating arrangement can accommodate roughly 600 people. The seats themselves are small, smaller than typical Roman theater seats, suggesting a different cultural approach to public gathering. The acoustics are good, but not optimized for performance in the way purpose-built theaters usually are. The sight lines focus on a central area, but that area shows no evidence of a stage or performance space in the traditional sense. This is the core mystery. What exactly was this building for? The physical evidence is precise enough to measure, but ambiguous enough to interpret multiple ways. The structure was built in phases over several decades, probably starting around 30 BCE and continuing into the 1st century CE. The theatrical seating was part of the original design, not a later addition. Carbon-14 dating of organic materials found in sealed contexts, ceramic typology, and architectural analysis all confirm the basic timeline. We know when it was built, we just can't agree on why. Scientific investigation has revealed additional puzzling features. The floor of the central area was decorated with elaborate geometric patterns in colored stone, hexagonal tiles fitted together in complex designs. This suggests something more formal than a simple meeting space. The roof structure, reconstructed from the pattern of fallen architectural elements, was sophisticated and expensive, coffered ceilings with decorative elements that would have been gilded or painted. Some researchers maintain it was indeed a temple, arguing that the seating was for ceremonial observers of religious rituals performed in the central space. Nabataean religion incorporated theatrical elements, and witnessing certain rites might have been a communal activity. The elaborate decoration and the processional approach support this interpretation. The problem is, we have no clear Nabataean parallel for this configuration. Their other temples don't look like this. Others argue it was a council chamber, a bouleuterion, where the civic leadership met and made decisions. The 600-person capacity would be roughly appropriate for a governing body in a city of Petra's size. The theatrical arrangement would allow speakers to address the assembly while being visible to all. But again, the decoration seems overly elaborate for a purely administrative function. A third interpretation suggests a mixed-use space, religious ceremonies, civic gatherings, possibly even entertainment, all taking place in the same venue depending on need. This feels unsatisfyingly vague, but might actually be closest to how the Nabataeans themselves thought about it. Our modern tendency to separate religion, government, and culture into distinct categories might not reflect ancient practice.
The cultural connection is complicated by the fact that we have limited Nabataean textual sources. We know them primarily through archaeology and the writings of outsiders, but some traditions persist. Local families in the region maintain oral histories about ancient gathering places where important decisions were made and where the community came together for events that were simultaneously religious and civic. These traditions don't provide technical details, but they suggest a different cultural framework than the Roman or Greek models we often default to. Contemporary archaeological work at the site continues to modify our understanding. Recent excavations in 2019 uncovered additional rooms adjacent to the main theater space, small chambers that might have been used for preparation or storage. The function remains unclear.
Everything about this complex resists simple categorization. Stand in the Great Temple today, and the scale is still impressive, despite 2,000 years of earthquake damage and erosion. The lower temenos is partially restored, giving a sense of what the colonnaded approach once looked like. The main building is more fragmentary. You can see the theatrical seating arrangement, but the roof is long gone, and many of the decorative elements are scattered or housed in museums. The colored floor tiles have been removed for preservation. What remains is the skeleton of something grand, whose full meaning eludes us. Visiting in early morning, before tour groups arrive, the space has a peculiar quality. You can imagine it filled with people, 600 voices in conversation or raised in ceremony. You can picture torchlight reflecting off gilded surfaces, the smell of incense, the weight of important moments. But you can't quite reconstruct what those moments were. The building speaks a language we've partially forgotten how to understand. What strikes me most about this place is how it demonstrates the limits of archaeology. We can measure everything, we can date it precisely, we can reconstruct the architecture with confidence, but we cannot excavate meaning. The purpose of this building was obvious to everyone who used it, required no explanation, was never written down because it didn't need to be. And now that cultural context is gone, leaving us with architecture whose function we can only guess at. The name Great Temple persists in the literature despite the uncertainty, mostly because we haven't agreed on what else to call it. Some publications now refer to it as the Great Temple/Bouleuterian Complex, or simply the Lower Market Temple Building. The awkward naming reflects our awkward relationship with a structure that refuses to fit our categories. Perhaps the real lesson is that the Nabataeans were doing something architecturally and culturally distinct, not just copying Roman or Greek models, but developing their own response to their specific needs. This building might represent a uniquely Nabataean approach to public space, one that integrated functions we now separate. If so, our confusion is evidence of their originality. They built something we don't have a name for because no one else built anything quite like it.
Before you reach the Treasury, before you enter the sick, you pass them. 4 massive stone blocks sitting in the landscape like abandoned dice from a game played by giants. Each one is roughly cube-shaped, carved from the bedrock, standing alone without context or obvious purpose. The locals call them jinn blocks, named after the spirits of Islamic tradition, beings of smokeless fire who occupy a realm between the human and divine. The name fits. There's something uncanny about them. The first one you encounter sits about 200 meters before the entrance to the sick. It's roughly 8 meters high, 9 meters wide, carved from the pink cream sandstone that characterizes this whole region. The surfaces are weathered smooth by millennia of wind and sand. There are no doors, no windows, no inscriptions, no obvious openings of any kind. It's just there, a massive carved block in the middle of the landscape, defying easy explanation. The discoverers, if we can call them that, were European explorers in the 19th century who documented Petra for Western audiences. But these blocks were never lost. Local Bedouin populations knew about them, incorporated them into their understanding of the landscape, gave them names that reflected their mysterious quality. The Western archaeological interest began around the 1920s and 30s, when serious surveys of Petra started attempting to catalog and understand every structure. But here we are, a century later, and consensus remains elusive. What are the jinn blocks? When were they made? What were they for? Step back in time with me. The Petra you know, the carved facades, the elaborate water systems, the urban center, didn't appear all at once. The Nabataeans occupied this area from roughly the 4th century BCE, but the major construction projects came later, 1st and 2nd century BCE into the 1st century CE. Before that, the landscape was different, less developed, more open.
The Jin blocks appear to predate much of what we think of as classical Petra. Archaeological evidence suggests these structures were carved during an early phase of Nabataean presence, possibly 3rd or 2nd century BCE. The dating is frustratingly imprecise because the blocks themselves offer few clues. There's no organic material to radiocarbon date, no inscriptions to provide chronological context. The architectural style is simple to the point of severity, no decorative elements that might link them to other dated structures. They're assessed primarily through comparative analysis with other early Nabataean architecture and their position in the landscape relative to later developments.
Here's what makes them particularly puzzling. They appear to be solid. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s suggested these are carved blocks, not hollow chambers. They're monuments, not buildings, massive architectural gestures that serve no practical function that we can identify. Or so we thought. Recent excavations around the base of one Jin block uncovered a small entrance, carved into the ground level and subsequently buried by millennia of sediment accumulation. Inside, a small chamber, roughly cubic, carved into the base of the block. Empty. No grave goods, no inscriptions, no evidence of use we can definitively identify, just empty space inside a massive stone block. This discovery simultaneously answered one question and multiplied others. They're not completely solid. At least one contains an interior chamber, but that chamber raises more questions than it resolves. Was this for burial? The size and simplicity don't match Nabataean tomb traditions visible elsewhere in Petra. Was it for ritual purposes? Possibly, but what kind of ritual requires a massive exterior block for a tiny interior space? Was it symbolic, the chamber representing something conceptually important rather than practically useful? We're back to guessing. Scientific examination of the carving techniques shows they were made using the same general methods as other Nabataean rock architecture, copper or bronze tools, probably with sand as an abrasive. The precision is less refined than later Petra structures, like the Treasury, which fits with an earlier dating. These feel like earlier work, less technically sophisticated, but more enigmatic. Multiple theories circulate in archaeological literature. Theory 1, these are early tomb monuments, markers for important individuals, with the actual burial chambers either inside, as the recent discovery suggests, or in separate underground locations marked by the surface blocks. Theory 2, these are religious markers, possibly representing deities or sacred space in ways that made sense within Nabataean cosmology, but are now opaque to us. Theory 3, these are territorial markers or boundary stones, massive architectural statements declaring Nabataean control of this landscape. None of these theories is fully satisfactory. Each requires assumptions about Nabataean culture and intention that we cannot verify. We're projecting interpretations onto silent stone. What connects these blocks to living culture is more atmospheric than specific. Bedouin oral traditions speak of ancient places of power, locations where the barrier between the human world and the world of spirits grows thin. The Jin blocks feature in some of these traditions, not with specific historical claims, but with a sense of significance that predates memory. They're treated with a kind of respectful wariness, acknowledged as important, without anyone quite remembering why. Modern visitors mostly ignore them. They're visible from the path leading to the Sikh, but most people are hurrying toward the more dramatic destinations deeper in Petra. The blocks don't photograph as dramatically as the Treasury. They don't have the obvious grandeur of the tomb facades carved into cliff faces. They just sit there, massive and inexplicable, while thousands of tourists walk past each day, barely noticing. But stop for a moment. Walk up to the nearest one. The scale becomes more apparent as you approach. 8 or 9 meters isn't spectacularly tall by modern building standards, but for a solid block of carved stone, it's impressive. Put your hand on the surface. It's surprisingly smooth, even after millennia of weathering. The stone is warm in the daytime sun, cold in the early morning. Try to imagine the effort required to carve this from the bedrock.
Try to imagine why someone decided it was necessary. I've stood next to these blocks multiple times, in different light, different seasons, and I'm never quite comfortable with them. There's something about their stark simplicity, their refusal to explain themselves, that feels intentionally enigmatic. Whether that intention was archaeological or I'm projecting meaning onto random ancient choices, I honestly cannot say. After everything I've learned, and I've read probably everything published about these structures, I find myself returning to the local name, Jin blocks. Structures that exist between categories, neither fully explained nor completely mysterious, present but not quite graspable. They're the right name for objects that resist our attempts to classify and understand them. They remind us, I think, that Petra's story is deeper and stranger than the famous images suggest. Before the Treasury, before the elaborate tomb facades, before the urban center with its sophisticated water systems, something else was happening here. The Nabataeans, or their predecessors, were making massive architectural gestures in the landscape for reasons we've lost. These blocks are older than the Petra we think we know. They're evidence of a longer, more complex story that we're only beginning to uncover. Stand at the entrance to Petra today before you walk through the Sikh toward the famous monuments. Look at these blocks. 4 of them in the immediate area, possibly others elsewhere not yet identified or now destroyed. They've stood here for roughly 2,000 years, maybe longer. They've outlasted the civilization that made them, and they're keeping their secrets still.